nothing to do, or you really wanted to hear Egerton Burroughs? Tell me. Tell me. Both? Both. Okay. Okay. No, we're so glad. You know, our speaker, of course, grew up in Myrtle Beach, so he has a lot to say. I hope you all got the email and text about bringing your pajamas, because we might be here for a while. But I have to tell you something funny. You know, I usually introduce the speaker, and I know enough about Egerton, since I've known him for 40 years, that I could have written a great introduction. But when I called him, he said, Diane, I mean it. I only want you to say, this is Egerton Burroughs. And I said, but Egerton, that's why I'm there, for introductions and to help with questions afterwards. And he said, whose show is this? You know, usually it's my show, but this is not my show. And so I'm going to honor him with what he asked me to do and simply say to you, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Egerton Burroughs.
Thank you. Can y'all hear me all right? You sure? I want to thank Diane for asking me to be here today. She's an old friend, as she said.
A young friend.
Again, I always open my mouth and get in trouble, but that's my nature. I want to thank Ann for being here today with me, my wife, who I love dearly. Thank you. Diane kind of opened the door.
I can't hear you.
You want to hold it and hold it close?
All right, is this better? All right. Diane and I have been on a little adventure together that I want to tell you just a bit about. The two of us have fought leukemia.
Multiple myeloma for me.
Multiple myeloma. You ahead of me. I just had leukemia. But we both went through a transplant. And it's an unusual thing. And your chances of survival sometimes are pretty slim. But the one thing that you need to know, if you will, if any of you ever had the chance to be a bone marrow donor, please do it. And they don't go in and snatch a piece of the bone out of your body. That's not how it's done. It sounds terrible. But all you do is sit in a reclining chair. They draw some blood out on one side. Blood comes in the other, and they take stem cells out of it. So if you ever get a chance, or your children or anybody, to be a donor, please do. The other thing is give blood. That's so important if you're going through a transplant process or anything else. Because as they destroy your marrow, you're living off of other people's blood. So if nothing else today, please think about being a bone marrow donor, which is not snatching the bones out of you, and think about giving blood. But anyway, Diane gave me a free hand today. She said, talk about anything you want. So I'm going to do it, but I need y'all to help me a little bit. How many people in this room were born in Horry County? Not too many.
Oh, that's a lot.
How many people were born out of South Carolina? Okay. All right. Now we're getting down to it. That's going to help me a little bit. And how many people were born north of North Carolina? Let's say north of Virginia or Tennessee. How many people? Okay. All right, now we're really cooking. Everybody in this room loves Myrtle Beach because you're here. If you didn't like it, you certainly wouldn't be in this room. I'm going to go back and take y'all on a little journey in time, and bear with me. And it doesn't have much to do with Myrtle Beach in the beginning of this story, but just have a little patience. I grew up in a little town not far away from here. It was called Conway, South Carolina. Grew up on a little street called Applewhite Lane. Nice little quiet street. We didn't have any TVs. The only thing for entertainment that was mechanical, I guess, was a radio, and you would listen to some good programs, The Shadow and other things. It was a quiet little neighborhood, and in the neighborhood, there were several people living. My grandfather and his sisters, and a sister of one of his brothers that had died. It was a quiet little neighborhood, and as children, we did what most children did in those times. We would play hide and go seek. We would hide in the bushes, do all kind of little things. But there was no internet, no little telephones, no nothing. So we were kind of on our own. And I was blessed to have a grandfather who would talk to me and tell me stories. And his sisters did the same. So I'm going to go back further in time, because what I was just talking about, again, there was no radio. Just a radio, no TV. When you talk to my granddaddy, and I called him Pa, and Aunt Lucille lived on the street, and Aunt Bess, Aunt Effie, and then Aunt Frances. And her husband had died when a turpentine still blew up and killed him. But we talked about Conway and how they grew up there. One of the things that we talked about was how we played. We played out in the bushes, and some of my friends, we would act like we were the Americans fighting the Germans or something like that, or the Japanese. Back in my granddaddy's day, they would hide in the bushes, play hide and go seek and things like that, and they would fight the Yankees. Now this is going back in time. When he was growing up, there was no electricity, no running water, no flush toilets. It was a different world. And that's the world he told me a lot about, growing up in Conway. Conway was a little town on the river. It was kind of unique. It was in the middle of Horry County, which we in now. And Horry County was very remote. It was covered with swamps, bogs, had a river going through it. But to get to Conway, you really had to work at it. I mean, they call it the Independent Republic of Conway. But you go back in time, there were no roads to speak of. Transportation was by wagon and mule and by boat. Think about that. When he was growing up and his time went on, in Conway, a lot of things were going on. There was a little cotton gin, the remains of it, down by the river. And he said long ago, cotton was a little bit of Conway, not much, because the soil around Conway really was not conducive to cotton. Not much of anything, really. It would grow some row crops, corn, vegetables, and things like that. But what was going on in Conway was the distillation of turpentine, taking the trees, the pine trees that were around Horry County, and you would take the sap out of the tree, you would gather that, you would move it by mule and wagon to the turpentine stills. those stills were fired by wood, and you would distill the product, and out comes turpentine and tar. I don't know how many of you have ever lifted or tried to lift a 55-gallon drum of water or oil or anything. It's pretty heavy. Recently, I bought a 55-gallon container of corn whiskey in the mountains. A friend of mine had gotten in trouble and needed to sell it. So I bought it, and getting that 55-gallon barrel up to the cookhouse, we had to split it into 2 barrels, still use a pickup truck to get it up there. Let's go back now, when there's nothing but a wagon and mules and moving these big barrels. All that stuff wound up coming to Conway. And what did they do with it? Well, they put it down by the river, put it in little warehouses and storage facilities. The other thing that was going on in Conway of importance was lumber, cutting lumber, boards, things of that nature. Where did that go? It went on the docks in Conway. The only way to get this stuff, really, from Conway to market was to go to Georgetown. And that was done primarily by steamboat. Steamboats that mostly were built in Conway. Right across from the Riverwalk now in Conway was the boat yard. And they repaired and built boats. Most of them were wood. The boats that operated out of Conway were all wood boats except one. And that was a metal boat. The smaller boats went upriver to places above Conway to take goods and bring goods back to Conway to be transported down to Georgetown. So you had the lumber business and you had turpentine, and there were very few people. It was a small community, hard-working people. And this community was pretty well devastated, as most southern towns were, by the war. There wasn't much left in the South. It was beat up. The banking system was pretty well destroyed. We didn't have any major railroads around Conway, but a lot of the major railroads were destroyed. The rails were twisted, bent up, so you couldn't use them. It was very difficult to do banking. The old money before the war wasn't any good, and then the Confederate money wasn't worth nothing after the war. So there wasn't really any banks much, so people survived with the barter system. All kind of different ways of bartering and keeping records. Some of the best records that are still floating around, unfortunately, are sitting in a warehouse in Conway, decaying, for lack of a home. But in those old ledgers, you will see where people bought lumber, did different things, and they did it on a credit. So when the crops came in, or you could sell some lumber or some turpentine, it was done on a ledger, and that was kind of the banking system at that time. The lumber came to Conway by floating down the river, tied together and brought to the mill, or in some instances, later on with steam engines, small ones that were built on tracks that went back into the woods. And these were temporary tracks. They would cut the lumber, bring it out, and get it on the boats. But I'm kind of jumping ahead of the story a little bit, talking about the railroads, and I'll come back to that again. But downtown Conway was a kind of a little hub People were together, working, trading, bartering. They got their goods from Georgetown, which came up like a steamboat, and they were brought to Georgetown by sailboat, big sailboats. Sailboats really ruled the world in the early days for moving freight of any kind. So these sailboats would come to Georgetown, unload their merchandise, and merchants in Conway, Georgetown, or other places would have placed order for sugar, fabric, whatever. These things would be transported upriver, and then again sold in Conway or some of the stops along the river. Conway was very isolated, as I said, and the Myrtle Beach part of the equation really wasn't in existence in those days. But along the river there were certain stops where people would come out to flag the boat down, pick up stuff, goods, canned goods, whatever they could get their hands on, bottled goods, clothes, and barter. It was a good time and a strange time, and people worked very hard. My granddaddy shared all these stories, and Aunt Bess, Aunt Lucille, and Aunt Frances. The ladies told the stories a little different twist. They would talk about going for rides on the steamboat, and they would pack a picnic lunch and get on the steamboat and ride down to Georgetown. That was a big to-do. There was no water on these sailboats. You had to bring what you wanted. There were no toilets. There was a little place you could hang out over the back and let her fly. And upstairs in the staterooms where they would go, and you could rent space up there, they had little pans. And they would fling that out later on. But I'm going back in time. There's no generator on the boat, no air conditioner, nothing like that going on. Pa said when he was growing up, they got their water, their drinking water, out of a little well, a little pipe. It had a handle on it. You'd pump your water up. And that was the main source of it. Now, to get your water for bathing and things like that, there was kind of a little what they call a spring box in the ground, kind of covered, and it would collect more water, and you could fill up a bucket and bring water up and use that for bathing or whatever you wanted to do. I asked him, I said, well, why did you go to all that trouble? Why couldn't you just go down to the lake and dip it up? He said, well, a lot of stuff went into the lake. And I said, like what? He said, well, when we were growing up, the outhouse we had was a 3-star. And they were all together, and underneath it was a long wooden trough. And people would tote water up to the top, and when you finished your business, you would pull a little plunger, and it would wash it down in the lake. He said that was not your common outhouse because there wasn't a lake and that much water to throw away. But water was a scarce commodity. We take it for granted, drinking out of the plastic bottles. But in those days, good water was scarce and hard to come by and much appreciated. The business started changing a little bit. Turpentine was what the backbone of Horry County was. As I mentioned, there was just a little bit of cotton, not enough to do any good. The soil wasn't right for that. We did pretty good with row crops, but tobacco wasn't anything in those days. It was nothing. R.J. Reynolds and all those people hadn't come along. tobacco was not a big market. So as the turpentine business started kind of getting wavery, people thought about a lot of different things, but we had to get the lumber going, keep things going. They decided, Pa's family, that they were going to build a railroad between Conway and Myrtle Beach. Myrtle Beach wasn't called Myrtle Beach then, it was just woods and a swamp, whatever it was. What it was important to Conway at the time was a place to get turpentine and lumber. That's all. The soil around Myrtle Beach wouldn't grow a damn thing, except pine trees. And through the years, we tried to grow a lot of different things. Overhead, none of it ever worked. We lost money on it. But in those days, we were coming to get the pine trees, and the way we'd been getting them was crossing the rivers, bringing the product to Conway. And I'm going back where I started about the weight of a barrel of rosin, turpentine, heavy. So the railroad was the way to get it out and get it over here. Now, there wasn't any railroads around here, but they thought they were going to build them a railroad. One of the family's partners long ago went up into Wilmington and somehow got involved in the banks up there and different things, and they kept in contact. And the family did their big banking really by going by sailboat down to Georgetown, by steamboat to Georgetown, getting on a sailboat and go to Wilmington. They really went to Wilmington because of old relationships. They could have gone to Charleston, but they went to Wilmington. So when they started looking for a locomotive, for train tracks and things like that, they went to Wilmington and talked to people and got information. And the train they wanted to get and the materials were pretty hard to come by. Money was scarce in those days. But anyway, they decided to buy used trains, used locomotives that were being taken off the tracks in New York City on the elevated railroad. Those trains were coal-fired. They bought them and got them down to Conway, converted them over to wood, and we're going to build them a railroad track. Conway was fortunate, and the workforce said it worked on the old steamboats for years, keeping those engines running. Knew a good bit about steam engines and how to operate them. So the labor force to work on them was kind of already there, but you had to build a railroad. So if you're going to build a railroad, just vodka.
No, it's actually some of that ale that you bought up in the mountains.
And if you're going to build a railroad, you got to know where to build the thing. So I had to figure that out. So my granddaddy was one of the people that was a surveyor on the cruise, surveying for the railroad. They started in Conway and worked their way towards the ocean. And it was a pretty tough journey. They had to go through the swamps. They had to go through the pine trees, what we call the bays, open areas with not much trees. And Pa said the heat at times was awful, and the bugs were bad. He said, but the worst thing about it was the scoggins and the hornets. And I looked at him and I said, well, Pa, I know what hornets are, but what are scoggins? He said, those were huge old black birds that would roost down in the bays, and when you were going through there, they took great delight in defecating on us. And if you out there in the woods and you got no place to bathe and you covered with that, it ain't good. But so they worked along and they finally got the railroad to Myrtle Beach. And like they wanted, they started bringing back the turpentine. There was some stills over there already, but they built more. Am I doing all right?
Yeah, just hold it higher.
How's that time doing?
Don't you got? I'm telling you, we brought our pajamas. It's okay.
Okay. And so they got it all over there, and we're working and building more turpentine stills and bringing that product out. But there wasn't really anybody at the beach. There never were. Just a few, very few people. And so people started to come to Myrtle Beach on the railroad. There wasn't anything much to see or do. And the business of the day was getting the turpentine out. Well, times began to change. The biggest change to affect Conway was probably the steel-hulled ships that started being built in great quantities. It kind of changed things. Turpentine was not in the best demand, sinking rapidly, tar and products for wooden-hulled ships. It was a dying business. Income was falling off. Just wasn't what it once was. But the company was still doing what it could, and in Conway they were involved in store operations, almost like banking, carrying people on a credit with groceries and different things. We sold mules. A fellow named Mr. Jones ran the stables. I was lucky enough to get to meet him and hear some stories about trading mules and how that was done in the county. There wasn't any tractors. There wasn't any trucks, nice roads, just mules, wagons. And I got to hear about all that stuff, and it was a true blessing. But again, the times were changing. You couldn't run those little stores and businesses without income coming into the community. And the family members had family to take care of. So they thought of other ways to make some money. And they decided to try to sell some land at the beach. Now, who wants to go to Myrtle Beach? And there's no water over there. There's no sewer. No garbage picked up. No paved roads. No doctors. It's just a railroad that goes to Conway and the ocean. In the beginning, it was pretty tough to sell a piece of dirt to anyone. We tried to sell acreage. It didn't work. No one wanted to buy land that wouldn't grow crops or anything except turpentine. So who wanted to buy acreage? Nobody. So they tried to hustle some lots. In the early days, if you bought a lot at the beach, they'd give you the lot back and the lumber to build your house if you bought that first lot. Imagine that. And it was tough selling that. They didn't really know how that dog was going to hunt. But they started selling some, and people came over. Some of the first folks that came over and lived here were people like Aunt Lucille and others, and they would share stories about the beach, about having to get water, groceries, things like that. What really helped early on was a big old whale washed up on the beach. People in Conway heard about this big whale, something that came in out the ocean. They came over, rode the train, and lots of people to see this thing. But there wasn't much over here. The people that did come enjoyed coming to escape the heat, which was awful, the humidity. The ocean had a nice breeze. Again, no air conditioning, no lights, no electric fans. And they didn't have that in Conway either. But that's kind of the story of how it all got started. And I'm not going to go any further than that because the rest of it is another chapter in the book. But the roots of the old pavilion lie back in these days when houses were first coming there, and there was what I call a gathering place. It wasn't much but shelter and a place of conversation. And through the years it evolved. And that's all I'm going to say on that, but that's my story today, and I thank you for listening to me.
Oh, no, you're not done yet. Oh, I'm sorry. I know this is your show, but we have a million questions. You can't leave us sitting there. And besides, you have plenty of time. Talk about how you used to work at the pavilion.
Okay. To start out, working at the pavilion was a great escape from Conway. Remember what I said about Conway? Small town, everybody knew what everybody was doing. I worked at Jerry Cox bagging groceries until I was old enough to get a driver's license. And when I got the driver's license, I knew it wouldn't be long before I could go to the beach. Marshall McMillan, myself, we got going over to the beach. There was an old Jeep car that we drove back and forth to the beach to work. But my first job, getting out of Conway, and I was thankful to do it, not because of Conway, but I did not want my daddy and mama to know if I snuck off and had a beer or whatever. But I reported to work at the Myrtle Beach Pavilion to a gentleman named Earl E. Houston. He was a great man. He stood up very nice, always had a little bit more of a stomach, had his glasses, his hair always in place. And he managed that place. And I reported to Mr. Houston. He said, Egerton, I'm glad you have come over here to work with us. Your daddy and mama and others have brought you here through the years to the rides, and I've met you. But I'm so glad you're here to work with us. And I said, thank you, Mr. Houston. And I said, what do you want me to do? He said, follow me. He handed me a bucket and a mop and some rubber gloves. I was very accustomed to the bucket and the mop because when we finished at the grocery store at nights, we had to mop the floors. I understood that. But he took me to the men's restroom at the bottom main floor of the pavilion where the steps go up to the dance hall. And he said, "This is your first job, and here we're going to be cleaning this restroom." And I said, "Well, I understand how to do that, Mr. Houston, but what are these rubber gloves for?" He said, "You put those on and you pick the cigarette butts out of the urinal." That was job number one. And then they would move you around to different parts of the pavilion to teach you how it worked. The shooting gallery was really fun. In those days, we had lead shot that went in tubes, and you had to wash the shot with kerosene and clean them off, and then you would load the tubes, take them down to the shooting gallery that ran on compressed air. And after about 2 weeks in the shooting gallery, listening to those things go off, you wanted to get away from there. It was a lot loud, and I wanted something better to happen. Then he put me in the French fry stand. And that French fry stand had a corkscrew. And you'd put the French fries in here, and they'd come out at a certain place. That wasn't so bad, but by the end of the shift, your toes, your legs, inside of your clothes, your hair, your nostrils were full of grease. That was fine. Eventually, you made your way around, and then you got out finally over into the amusement park. And that's when they really put you in a bad place. They start you out on the little kiddie ride where the boats are going around. And they have little bells on each one of the boats. And every kid's got to ring it. And after the end of that shift, you had about all the bells you ever want to hear. Then they do what they do to every new person. Someone comes up and says, "Mr. Yo," and he was the guy that ran the ride. So, "Mr. Yo wants you to go get the track stretcher and bring to him." And I said, "Well, where do you go?" And so, "Go over there and ask so-and-so." I'd go ask this person, they'd say, "No, you have to go back over him." And after about 15 stops, you figured out there was no such thing as a track stretcher for the roller coaster. And then you were welcomed into the club. But those were some of the days at the pavilion that I cherished and loved. One of the days that I'll never forget was when they passed the civil rights legislation. And that went into effect. It was going into effect the next day. Mr. Houston got us all upstairs in what was later called the magic attic. He got us all in there, said, "Now tomorrow, we're going to start serving everybody that walks in here, black or white, drinks. They're going on the beach. They want to rent a bathing suit, whatever. It's a new day. And this company's going to be in the lead." Now, anybody that can't go with that program, you can get your check at the back of the room. And no hard feelings. But it's a new day. And we're going to start off right. I'll never forget that. I was so proud that day. And that was one of the better days at the pavilion. And the next day there was some trouble around town. I guess, Peter, you remember some of that. I don't know. But things kind of got all right. But the pavilion was a leader in that, and I was proud of them. And they were a leader in so many other things. But that's the pavilion story.
And in just a moment, we're going to open the floor for questions, but I happened to be at the press conference the sad day that the pavilion, they made the announcement that the pavilion was closing. And I have to say, nobody was sadder and actually shed tears than Egerton, because he grew up there, it was his family's. And, you know, so many people wonder how Egerton really felt. Well, I can tell you that day at the press conference, no one was sadder than you. And it was, you know, all from your heart.
That was a hard day, folks. A very hard day. Closing that thing was, it was a tough journey, and if anybody's got any questions about closing the pavilion, I'll do my best to answer them. I suspect that's on some people's minds.
Well, first, could you tell us how the pavilion came to be first?
I can't really hear you. I'm gonna come over here.
Can you tell us how the pavilion came to be? You didn't tell us.
And Egerton, if you'll come back here, that way you can be on, you know, if folks at home are watching this as well. People all over America are watching this, Egerton. And they want to see you. And I'll be glad to listen to the question and help you with that. But how did the pavilion come to be?
Well, I believe I started off on that earlier. It was more or less of a shed and a place to get out of the weather and gear in together. And it took many shapes and forms through the years. It was a gathering place, wood structure. Again, no water, no sewer for the longest time, no electricity. It was shade and a place together. Through the years, it got a little more complicated, better construction of wood. A gathering place is mostly what it was. Some entertainment and this, you know, like food, beverage, things of that nature, a place to wash. As it grew up and got more, there was a little bit of food served and different things. Again, it was all wood.
Bands playing music.
There was an old wooden building, a housing place, a little small hotel that was built. And again, not much water, sewer, electricity. The beach was just really growing, so the pavilion kind of came along in phases. The one that most of us are familiar with is the last one, the concrete block one. And that's what most people grew up really knew. It was built when the wooden one burnt, and it was built out of concrete and supposedly to be fireproof and hurricane proof. And it did a fair job of that. It withstood Hurricane Hazel. And there was a little area across the street where a carnival would come in the summertime and be there for the summer for entertainment. That was the first real entertainment there was. And the carnival would be different ones each year. And at the end of the season, that was it. There was nothing there, really. Later on, as business grew, things got better. The company decided to buy one of the carnivals. And that happened to be the one that Mr. Houston, his brother Don, worked in. And that carnival was owned by a fellow named Harry Beach. they bought the carnival, Mr. Beach, and when the family started operating it, the first thing they did was to take the games out of it. The games that the carnivals usually make their most money on, kind of the crooked ones. The games that we operated were legitimate. For right or for wrong, but that's what we did. So the pavilion, as we all got to know it, was run in a little different way than most carnivals. It was early what I would call an amusement park. Not the great big ones, but Mr. Houston developed that thing through the years into a nice family-run park. The other thing about the pavilion, we never served any beer, no liquor, stuff like that. The family did not want any part of that, and that was a good thing. And the pavilion flourished in that environment and the families, and it became just a great place. We'd all go down and listen to the organ and have a good time. And it was built on family spending money there. And when the families quit coming to the pavilion, when the crowd changed that hung out in that part of town, when the law enforcement and all that kind of left him and went out to Market Commons, that part of town started deteriorating. And I can promise you, we tried everything we could do to keep that place going. We tried to put a fence around it and charge admissions to keep the rough people out. It didn't work. So we finally had to shut her down. And it was probably, besides losing a family member, that was the most horrific day of my life. I have to sit up there in front of a bunch of people like today and say we're going to close something down that I always thought and still do was the heartbeat of Myrtle Beach. And I call it sacred ground.
Since you're speaking about the pavilion, Rich Hare is here. Rich, where are you, honey? Where is Rich? Rich is in the back, but Rich helped to run the pavilion for years, and we'd be remiss if we didn't say hi to Rich. He came to support you. Thank you very much, Rich, for all your days at the pavilion. And so we want to see if there's any other questions. There's one, certainly. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah. Was there dancing at the pavilion?
We had a lot of dancing at the pavilion. Downstairs by the bathhouse and number 2 soda fountain, we had a great little jukebox that was covered in plywood, had a door on it. And you could go out there and put money in that sucker and play good beach music, and everybody did the shag. And it was my job and others at times to go put the lock on that thing and stop it. And you would just about get in a fight. People like Skeeter Nash and other people would get all upset. And but the reason we cut it off was so they would go upstairs to the magic attic, as we eventually call it, and we had bands up there and all type of good dancing music. In those days, the parents would drop the children off at the pavilion. They'd go out and eat dinner or whatever, and let the children come up to the magic attic and dance. There was no fear in downtown. There was law and order, and it was a family environment. Lots of dancing.
Those were the days. Have some water. And then I know that you need to introduce our special guest.
We have with us today the chair lady of Burroughs and Chapin Company.
Stand up, Debbie.
Her name is Debbie Burroughs. She is the first.
Welcome, Debbie.
She is the first lady to be the chairman of the company, and we are so proud of her. And she's doing a great job. And it's not an easy thing to do.
We're glad you're here, Debbie. And what have we missed?
Oh, goodness.
There's a million stories.
Yeah, there are.
I think Egerton needs to be booked again.
And bring Debbie.
And bring Debbie. Bring Debbie.
And Debbie works for the bank here, Anderson Brothers.
Yes, Debbie. Ann wants you to know that Debbie works for Anderson Brothers Bank right
In
here.
addition to being chairman of the board.
In
of
addition to
Burroughs and
being
Chapin.
chairman of the board for
So
Burroughs
she's a
and
busy
Chapin.
lady.
We appreciate it. Yes, Buddy Stiers, who was one of our speakers in the past.
Egerton, I bet if you asked everybody here that worked in the pavilion to raise their hand, you won't be surprised how many hands will go up.
How many people worked at the pavilion?
Let's see.
And I'm like Burroughs, I started out taking pictures for Skips after Jack Thompson left. I took his place.
You followed in Jack Thompson's footsteps? That was big footsteps.
With the jail bars and all that kind of stuff. And then to the bathhouse. So I've been there, been to the beach. So from 56 to 64, when I got married, where I met my wife upstairs in the pavilion that Egerton's talking about.
Wow.
59 years later, still stuck with her. So.
The love story. The love story of Penny and Buddy at the pavilion.
That brought back a little story, and it slipped my mind, and some people would probably want to hear this, some not. But in the old days, we used to rent bathing suits at the pavilion. You'd come to town and you'd go into the men's bathhouse. You could rent a bathing suit. Ladies, we rented those bathing suits. And we had little lockers. You'd put your clothes in. And the lady that did most of the laundry there was a lady, Rosabelle Dow, and her family members worked at the pavilion as well. But there's a story that's floating around. I've never really gotten the truth out of it. But in the bathhouse, there was a hole cut in the wall. A little hole, about like that. And some of the guys that worked there would peek through the hole into the ladies' side. And we've always wondered who cut the hole in the wall. We used to kid Lawrence LaBruce about it. Lawrence worked there along with Skeets Bellamy, Jack Devine, and many more locals. But no one ever confessed who cut the hole in the wall. Billy?
Billy Elford.
I was searching for the track stretcher.
Other questions? Yeah, Billy has a serious
I
question.
think it's important for a lot of people to know that Burroughs and Chapin Company has played a significant role in the growth and development of Myrtle Beach. And Egerton, his leadership after closing the pavilion and the amusement park, with the expansion of so many great things, Grand Dunes is one, and so many others, has played a major role in making sure that the state and the federal government provide us the resources that we need, and boy, he needs a big hand of applause.
Absolutely, Egerton. Egerton, you and the entire board of Burroughs and Chapin, and may we say, not only the growth of the past, but the growth of the future, and having been involved in so many nonprofit organizations in this town, they wouldn't even be in existence if it wasn't for Burroughs and Chapin and their dedication. I know the Art Museum would certainly agree to that, Debbie, and so many other nonprofits, and so we're very grateful. Yes, my friend, you're up next.
Edison, I just wanted to correct you on one point.
Yeah.
I know Conway always thought this was the frontier over here, but there were some families over here, and my Todd family was one of those groups. There was Owens and Raines and others.
Oh, yeah.
So it wasn't frontier land, and I can thank you for building that railroad, because all of these were subsistence farms and fisheries off the beach.
Yeah.
My great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather had a fishery at Wither Swamp.
Yeah.
And my grandfather, Dan Nance, came down from Brunswick County, met his wife in 1910 here at that fishery. And his father had the first fast food restaurant in Myrtle Beach.
Oh, yeah.
He had a fishing shack at the end of the railroad track, and it went all the way to the beach. And he sold fish sandwiches for a nickel.
Wow.
So he had the first fast food restaurant in Myrtle Beach. That was help me out, Clay. What was Granddaddy Nance's name? Marshall Holmes Nance.
Yeah.
Right. That's my cousin back here. He's a historian. But anyway, if it hadn't been for Conway, we'd still be picking cotton. My mother picked cotton in 13th Avenue South. There wasn't subsistence farms down here.
Yeah.
And thank you for bringing the railroad down here and letting us cut those railroad ties for you. Thank you very much. One other thing, I worked at the beach as a lifeguard. And we used to send them for shoreline. We'd send the girls on the beach, go down to the next lifeguard stand, tell them I need 100 yards of shoreline, and they'd get past that girl. We'd have them all go all the way to State Park, looking at the shoreline. Anyway, Egerton, appreciate what you and the family have done. Thank you very much. My name is Bob Gray.
We know that. We all know Bob Gray. We need to get him up here to do one of these history series, Mr. Bob Gray. And you know, Egerton, I think it's important that we say, too, that for those of you who are interested in the pavilion, the library here sells copies of the pavilion video, which is called Hard to Say Goodbye. Chuck and I were proud to put that together with Egerton. It was a sad day being at the pavilion that day as everybody was crying, and so that's why it's called Hard to Say Goodbye, but the video really is extraordinary. And one more thing I want to say about Earl Husted, you brought him up. When I interviewed him years ago, his comment was, hiring young people, it wasn't just about learning how to run the rides or how to sell the food. It was about ethics in business. And Earl was so concerned that every one of his employees grow up to be better people, better men, better women. And I thought that was really interesting, but he was that kind of man, wasn't he?
He was a great teacher. He had the highest ethics, work ethic, and he took great delight, as you said, in working to help young people, giving them jobs and teaching them how to conduct themselves. And so many people in Myrtle Beach learned a lot from Earl Husted and owe him a lot.
And Egerton Burroughs.
Yes.
And Egerton Burroughs. Any further questions, my friend? Well, I know you want to join me with a big round of applause for a wonderful man, a great community leader and supporter, and someone we are so lucky to know, Egerton Burroughs. We love you. Friends, I do want you to know that there'll be other programs coming up. They are all listed online with the Friends of the Chapin Library. And Jennifer, I know you have an announcement to make about one event. Y'all are going to want to know about this event that Jennifer wants to mention.
Before y'all run off, I do have two events that are a series that's happening. And as and an event that is happening on Monday that is hosted by the Friends of Chapin Memorial Library. So each Tuesday we have our jazz series. It's at 5:30.
Please give Jennifer your attention because you're going to want to hear this. I know if you like history, you're going to want to hear this.
On Monday night, this coming Monday, the Friends of Chapin Memorial Library are hosting a night at the Ocean Forest, Memories and Stories with Jack Thompson and Dino Thompson. This is an event that you don't want to miss because all of our speakers are such wonderful storytellers, and these two gentlemen are just that. We are having a reception at 5 p.m. for our Friends members. So if you are not yet a friend of Chapin Memorial Library, you can become one at the front desk for just $10, and then you can RSVP to that portion of the event. I encourage you to do so because will be a very well-attended event. You can get that early entrance and hopefully get your early seat because seating is limited. But doors will open to general admission at 5:45 for anyone else. So please keep that in mind. And like I said, we also have our jazz series happening. And thank you all very much for coming, especially Egerton and Ann. I do appreciate you being a part of the series and contributing to the library as you do. You all have a great day. Thanks for being a part of the community.
February 21st is Carolyn and Russ Mates. March 20th is the Cecil Patrick family. We will see you again soon, friends, and we appreciate all of you. Thank you.
I can't hear on a good day, so I'm going to hear myself.
Pretty girl, how you Davis. How you doing? Good to see you. You can tell Mom. Hey, brother. How you doing, buddy? Good to see you.
Yeah, because they were like, I mean,